The first dust collector I had for the CNC was awful, so I brought this one into the shop, built a mobile cart, and I'm going to show you how. The first step in building this mobile dust collector cart is over at the miter saw, where I cut down some 2x4s for the frame. I use stops against the fence to make repetitive cuts quickly and accurately. Next up, I need to add pocket holes to a handful of pieces, so I use a smaller pocket hole jig on these longer boards since it's easier to manipulate, and I go ahead and clamp the boards to my bench for some added stability. With the long boards finished up, I break out a different pocket hole jig and drill holes in the remaining smaller pieces that will be used for the top and bottom of the walls, as well as the base of the cart. Just so y'all know, if at any moment you realize, wow, I really want to make this project, I do have plans available. They are linked in the description below, and I also have one-to-one DXFs for some of the parts that I ended up cutting on the CNC. So the price that I pay for not hooking up the shop vac is shaking out all that dust. To assemble the base, I mark the locations for each middle board on the board that will be the front and back of the base. I use a square to transfer the lines to both boards at once, which improves speed and accuracy. Next, I grab some 2.5-inch pocket hole screws and assemble the base. To give myself enough material to secure the casters to, I add some blocking to the inside corners. And also, since the base wasn't completely flat, adding this blocking ended up giving me a flat surface to connect those casters to. So with the wall and base framed up, I clamp them together and run 2 screws through the base plate of the wall into each one of the cross members of the base. I always love a good excuse for firing up the radial arm saw, so I grab some plywood and cut out the bottom of this cart. All the plywood I used for this cart is left over from other projects, but if you're buying materials specifically for this build and not just using leftover materials, I'd go with 3/4-inch plywood just to add some rigidity. With the bottom piece in place, I mark where the 2x4s are and then secure it with a handful of 1¼ inch screws. The piece I was using for the back panel of the cart had a ton of staples along the edge, so I bent those over to keep them out of the cutter's path as much as possible and cut the piece just a little bit oversized in case there were irregularities with the wall that I framed up. I used an older end mill knowing that I'd end up cutting through a handful of staples and I didn't want to ruin a new cutter. This worked out great and it actually didn't get near as beat up as I thought it would. After cutting through all those staples though, I did take a quick second and check out the cutter and just make sure that it was still safe to use. To attach the back panel, I repeat the same process as before of marking the 2x4s and then securing it to the cart with a bunch of 1¼ inch screws. Here I'm using a collated drill that's typically used for drywall installation or deck building, and as you can see, it really makes the process pretty quick. But so does speeding up the video 10x. With the back panel installed, I now grab my router that has a flush trim bit in it, and I cut the piece flush with the wall's frame. To cut the angled side panels, I'm back over at the shop bot. Here again, there are a couple of staples in the edges, so I overhang the material as much as possible in an effort to keep some of the staples out of the tool path. Once the sheet is in place, I turn on the vacuum pump and push the sheet flat against the table. Here I'm running a 1/4 inch down cut end mill, and I take 3 passes to cut through the plywood, running at 5 inches a second. Before attaching the sides to the cart, I run a small 1/4 inch round over along the diagonal edges. Since I'll be reaching into and around this area of the cart a lot, I wanted to soften those edges so I wouldn't constantly be busting my knuckles on them. Before I actually start installing the casters, I decided to do a quick gravity test first, and good news, it still works. Once I figured out how to actually use a drill again, I finished attaching the casters using some 2.5 inch heavy-duty pocket hole screws. Next up, I screw some 2x4s to the top of the cart where I'll attach the dust collector. I ran in 2.5 inch long construction screws into each stud, but anything longer than that up to 4 inches would work just fine. Rockler sent out their Dust Right 2500 CFM dust collector along with a handful of accessories, so a big thank you goes out to them for helping me out with this project. And before I get started drilling holes in this thing, I want to get all the parts unpacked and laid out. Also, this floor sweep can double as a hat. Once all of the locations are figured out, I mark where I want the dust collector to be, and I pre-drill some holes for the lag bolts that'll secure the unit to the cart. I, of course, didn't remember to turn the camera back on to show you that, so my apologies. And with the cart gracefully slid off of the workbench, I check real quick to make sure it's not all cattywampus and get ready for painting. I know it's just shop furniture, but I really had it in my head that this would be painted, and since I had a bit of white paint left over from the last chicken coop I built, well, I painted it white. Also, something slightly remarkable happened while I was painting. I decided to test fate, not put on my usual painting attire. It's nothing short of a miracle that I didn't end up with any paint on me at all. Once the paint was dry, I ran the lag bolts in with about a ½ inch sticking out. I hung the rubber strips over the bolts and then lifted the dust collector into place and ran the lag bolts in until the unit was firmly held to the cart. I installed the splitters so that I can have one hose hooked up to the CNC and another hose available for accessories at any time. Next up, I installed the adhesive-backed foam around the exhaust port and the dust collection bag until my canister filter arrives, and then I connected 28 feet of hose. With the hose installed, I pulled out a section of the metal wire and wrapped it around the screw that holds the splitter in place. This will help to prevent buildup of static electricity, which, if discharged while the CNC is running, can cause some weird things to happen. With a multimeter, I check for continuity between the wire and the ground lug on the electrical plug to make sure that everything's hooked up correctly. One accessory that I definitely wanted to be on the floor sweep was the magnetic attachment. It easily pops into the front of the sweep and can be removed and carried over to a trash can to be cleaned off. Needless to say, sucking up metal objects into a dust collector is ill-advised, and it could damage the impeller or even cause a spark and start a fire. With everything hung up and installed, the setup keeps all the dust collection accessories easy to access and use without having to unhook anything from the CNC. Hey y'all, thanks for watching the video. I hope it was helpful. If you have any comments or questions, leave them below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And until next time, have fun making something.